Governor Berger has come out with a tight budget that includes some new resources for key initiatives, especially in child protection and response to the opioid crisis. But there's a widespread call for more help with needs in transportation and learning. With a look at the budget is our guest, the Executive Director of the Mass Budget and Policy Center, Noah Berger. Thank you very much for being with us, Noah.
Great to be here. Thank you.
First of all, Noah, talk about the revenue side of this, because it's a 3.5% increase over last year. That sounds kind of reasonable. Why complain about that? But what about the revenue the governor has to work with?
Yeah, when you look at the long-term picture, we're beginning another budget cycle, and again, there's no real discussion about important things that could really improve people's lives, like making public higher education more affordable or investing the money necessary to fix both our public transportation system, but also our roads and bridges that need significant work. And there's reasons why we've been in this pattern for a number of years now, which is, if you look back to the period between 1998 and 2002, the state cut income taxes by over $3 billion. And that's led to a decade and a half of deep budget cuts. We've cut per pupil funding in higher education by over $4,000 a student. And not surprisingly, tuition and fees have gone up by $4,000 a student per year, which over 4 years adds up to between $16,000 and $20,000. That's why things like higher education are becoming more expensive, less affordable. It's why we've cut funding for local aid by 40% over the last 15 years. And that has a direct effect on the quality of services in people's local communities. And you're right, it goes back to the revenue picture, that when you cut taxes that deeply, it leads to cuts in things that are important. And it also means that every year we can barely balance our budget. So even in good times, we're really not putting away the kind of money for a rainy day that we should be.
Well, one thing the governor is trying to do is fill some of the gap for the skilled jobs that we don't have enough people for right now. He wants to increase workforce development. I think no one would be against that. But look at the picture of what's going on with skills in the workforce, because people like me, we're getting older, we're going to retire, and how do things balance out in the years ahead?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the governor does have some small initiatives in workforce training, but they're pretty small. And that's an area where the Commonwealth could be making significant investments and making sure that as some of our older workers with certain levels of skills, particularly in manufacturing, retire, that we bring along a new generation. He actually has done a good job with vocational education, which is an area where our vocational schools in the Commonwealth are working, but they have long waiting lists. There are a lot more kids who want to get into those schools than we have space for. And kids who come out of those schools are getting pretty good jobs. They're doing a good job. The governor's proposed some money for capital spending to make sure they have equipment, and a little bit for coordinating the work between those schools and the local communities. But to actually ramp up spending on our vocational schools to the level where all the kids who want to go into vocational schools could do that would take significant resources. But in the long term, that is the question, is how do we make sure that we have the highly skilled workforce that employers are looking for? And we're in pretty good shape in Massachusetts, which is that right now we have ultimately the best educated workforce in America. And that's important. That's why we get companies like GE coming here. It's why we have high wage jobs. But there are a whole lot of people who are being left behind who, if we could invest more in making sure every kid has good preschool and then good K through 12 education and can afford to go to college, we'd have a lot more highly educated and well-skilled workers, and if our vocational programs could expand and cover more kids. That could give us even more depth in a highly skilled workforce, which would be good both for all those kids who can then become parents and raise their own kids, but it's also great for the state economy, because that's how you become the kind of place where employers who have high-wage jobs want to come and locate.
You mentioned one set of people waiting, but you've got waiting lists for charter schools. You've got district schools that aren't getting fully reimbursed for charter expansion. And Mayor Walsh, in his State of the City speech, says the one thing he asked for from the state more than anything else was pre-K.
Yep. So funding for early education and care is something else that's been cut deeply over the last 15 years as a result of income tax cuts. And every year there's more research that shows that when you invest in early education, those kids do well throughout their K through 12 years, and ultimately as adults. They're more productive, and that's better in the long term for the state economy. But again, those are investments that we haven't been able to make. The other thing to remember with early education is it's also important, honestly, is childcare. That is, if you have particularly single parents who want to enter the workforce and succeed in the workforce, they can't do that unless there's some way to care for their kids while they're at work. And it's sort of a double benefit if you can both help those parents to succeed in the workforce, but then also provide their kids with high quality early education and care that prepares them so that when they go to preschool or school, they're as ready as higher income kids. And And studies, particularly of the Boston early education programs here in the Boston public schools, have shown enormous gains for those students, that when they go through that program, they do much better when they get to school. And we've had similar evidence for a lot of other programs.
Turning to transportation, day to day we focus a lot on fare increases and the need for management reforms in the T, but talk about the bigger picture, because the huge amount of money is about the things you got to fix or replace.
Yeah. Here I think it is both issues have to be confronted. I think that there probably are real opportunities within the T in terms of how it's managed to improve the management efficiencies there. And Stephanie Pollack, the new Secretary of Transportation, has been focused really hard on how do you make sure that agency is running as efficiently as it possibly can. I think that's incredibly important. But the other half is, you're right about also, if you're running 40-year-old trains that have a useful life of 20 years, they're going to break down in snowstorms. And we saw that pretty vividly last year. We have switching systems, the systems that control when trains stop and go, that are way beyond their useful life and that need to be replaced. And those things cost money. And the longer you put off making those kinds of investments, the more you're going to be paying repairs going along. But eventually you're going to have to make those investments. And there's no way to do that without raising revenue to make the investments that need to be made.
We've heard the environmental argument for transit-oriented housing, but talk about the need for economic growth, because if there is going to be growth, people need to live someplace, and a lot of communities, they don't want more people coming in to live.
Yeah. I think one thing we want to look at is how to make sure we locate more housing where there is existing public transportation. That can be both in our inner city, and some of the gateway cities, some of our lower income cities near Boston have access to good public transportation, Brockton, Lynn, Chelsea potentially. So there are places where you could put more housing and more other types, jobs and business locations that would not add to gridlock in cars if you could put them on places where there is existing access to transportation. And I think it also is a question of zoning to some degree, to make sure that when we are spending state money on improving our transportation system, that we're making sure that the areas around where that new transit is going are places where people are going to be able to live and do business.
Probably the single biggest area of spending to be concerned about is on healthcare. The governor's allowing a certain amount of an increase. He's trying to get more efficient about things, but there's also concern from some quarters out there that the level of Medicaid spending for mass health here, we just can't go that way that much longer.
And this is obviously a problem throughout our economy, as healthcare costs over a very long period of time have been rising fairly rapidly. There's some evidence nationally that since the Affordable Care Act passed, we've seen a moderation in healthcare cost growth, which is a good thing. We're beginning to see changes in how we pay for healthcare that focus more on outcomes and less on sort of paying for every single procedure, which drives providers towards focusing more on primary care and spending money on those things that may take a little bit upfront cost, but not much, but that could avoid much larger costs down the line. So I think in the long term, the way to solve the healthcare cost problem is to try to keep people healthier. And that's both things within the healthcare system, but then thinking of broader public health issues. How do we make sure that kids have playgrounds to play in, or senior citizens have places to walk so that people are getting exercise? How do we make sure that kids are learning about good nutrition so they eat well and stay healthy? And I think that there are a lot of those bigger picture questions about how you keep a population healthy. And the more we can focus on those things, I think it's ultimately the long-term strategy that can really work.
What about the kind of tax burden we have? I mean, we're coming down now from some tax decreases. Some of them were the overturning of tax increases that were passed during a time of crisis. But what's the best way to get some of that needed revenue without unduly burdening people?
Yeah, it's a good question. Massachusetts overall for individuals is pretty much in the middle of the pack in terms of overall state and local taxes as a share of income. For businesses, we're actually a little bit below average. The odd thing about our tax system, though, is that the highest income people in the state, people in the incomes over $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, $1 million, pay less of their income in taxes than low and middle income people. So most of the population, the bottom 90% or so, pays about 9.5% overall of their income in taxes. That's when you add together sales taxes, property taxes, gas taxes, income taxes. It comes out to a little bit less than a tenth of our income. The highest income 1% of the population pays altogether about 6.5% of their income in state and local taxes. So the people who've been the big winners, frankly, in our economy over the past several decades, also the big winners in our tax code. And that difference, the fact that the highest income people spend pay 3.5 percentage points less than everybody else, costs the state about $2 billion a year. That is to say, if our highest income residents just paid the same overall rate of taxation, same share of their income in taxes as everybody else, we'd have about $2 billion a year more in revenue. And that would be money that you could use to fix our roads and bridges, fix our public transportation system, make higher education affordable, or expand access to early education, or improve our K through 12 schools. So there's a lot of things that could really make people's lives better that we have not really been able to invest in the Commonwealth over the last 15 years. And you're right, it goes right back to the revenue question, to basic flaws in our tax system.
I got to ask you about GE again because it's gotten a lot of attention. It's a tax break, but some other people say it's just a down payment on future growth.
So I think the big story on GE is GE wanted to be in Massachusetts because of the fundamentals. We have the best educated workforce in the country. We have this sort of what they called the economic ecosystem that they're looking for, which has a lot to do with having well-educated workers. And I think that's why they're here. There were incentives, and I think most people who look at those things say the incentives ultimately are not why people make decisions. I will say there's a lot of evidence other states are offering GE a lot more money. The state offered, it appears, mostly infrastructure help. That is, we're going to help make sure that there are roads and other amenities.
Some of that had to be done
working,
anyhow, right?
Which I think had to be done anyway. So my guess is the incentives are not why we came here. We may not have had to spend even the amount that we spent. But the big picture is they're here because over the long term, Massachusetts has focused on the fundamentals and making sure we're the kind of state that has the workforce that companies are looking for, and the basic quality of life that people who are deciding where to live. Ultimately, this is GE's executives saying, is that the kind of community, the kind of city I want to live in? And Massachusetts has a high quality of life. We have well-educated workers. Some of that's at risk. If we don't fix our transportation system, there are going to be companies looking at Massachusetts and saying, I'm not going to locate somewhere where my workers can't get to work. If higher education becomes increasingly unaffordable, we could lose some of the advantage we have there. So there are challenges there, but we should take pride in the fact that Massachusetts has, for a long time, done a lot of things well.
Another area that's certainly going to affect the budget is the cost of incarceration. There have been a lot of policy moves, even up in the legislature, to change sentencing and what happens after somebody is released. Do you see much room for improvement here?
I think there is definitely room for improvement. We've had this period from the 1980s until about 4 or 5 years ago where incarceration rates all over the country skyrocketed, which means more and more people are not going to be able to be productive citizens. They're going to be locked up in jail. And several states have taken the lead in reforming their incarceration policies. They've seen fewer and fewer people incarcerated. There's been no adverse effects on public safety as far as anybody can tell. And it brings those people sooner back into society where they can work and support a family and begin to contribute again. And I think there is a lot of progress that Massachusetts could make in that direction.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Great. Thank you.
Noah Berger from the Mass Budget and Policy Center.